Well, I think we're all here. Good morning. My name's Gary Marbut. My son likes me to start these sessions by saying, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to Gardening for the Northern Rockies. We hope you're in the right place. Really, this is Introduction to Handguns for Women. I'm the president of the Montana Shooting Sports Association, and I will be your chief instructor today. As you know, we'll spend the morning here in the classroom, we'll spend the afternoon at the range, and we'll all have a good time. But I think you'll find that when you leave this class, I hear many of you saying you don't have much experience with firearms. We've actually had people come to the classes who were very afraid of firearms, had no knowledge about them, and left with a surprising comfort level. So I think you'll find when you're done with the class, Sheila's going, I think when you're done with the class, you'll find that you attain a surprising comfort level, and you'll get a lot out of the class, even though those of you who have some familiarity with firearms. Well, let's start talking about guns. Why does a person want to own a firearm? Why would anybody want to own a firearm? Well, there are a number of reasons. Certainly you read in Armed and Female, Paxton Quigley's book, the issue about crime statistics and how many ladies may in their lifetimes be the victim of a violent crime. And that's a motive. That's a good motive. And really, I mentioned that reason first because that's why we're here. We would like to see you empowered to be able to choose not to be a victim. And it's pretty much axiomatic that you cannot depend on other people to provide for your own personal protection. Certainly there are not enough police out there to interpose themselves between you and some criminal who might prey upon you. And many of you, I hear you saying that in the past you've depended upon a husband or a boyfriend or somebody like that for your protection, and that's good when they're around. I mean, it's nice they can do that for you, but it's not something that you can count on all the time. If there were enough police out there that they could interpose themselves between the criminals and the victims with any regularity, we would have a police state. And of course, that's not what we want in America. We want a free society. But what that means is it becomes incumbent upon you to provide for your own personal protection because you just can't count on somebody else to do it. We do know that the courts have held that the police have no legal responsibility to protect any one of you individually. They only have a responsibility to provide a general level of protective services to the community, and that just makes sense. You know, I know lots of police officers. They're really good people. They're well motivated, and they would love nothing. They dream of chances to be able to catch a criminal in the act of victimizing one of you and arrest them right there and protect you and take the criminal away to jail. But they just can't be there. There aren't enough of them. And any time of the day in Missoula County, there are 2 or 3 deputies on the road, deputy sheriffs. In the city of Missoula, there are more city police, but it's just, they can't be there for you. They're usually the cleanup squad. They do the investigation afterwards. They try and track down the criminal, but they can't prevent you from being victimized. So, we believe that it's appropriate for you to take personal responsibility for your own personal security and protection. Now, certainly that's a decision, that's a choice for you, and we're a land of free choice. And there are some people who may look at this whole personal protection business and say, look, I just don't want to deal with it, I can't contemplate the possibility of taking another human life, and so I guess I'll just have to be a victim rather than worrying about personal protection. Well, I think that that's it's appropriate for a person to be able to make that choice. But that's not the choice that I'd make, but I would applaud somebody for actually thinking it through far enough to have made that choice. There are people, ladies, who really haven't thought much about it and haven't decided what they would do if there was a situation where they were being victimized. If they would resist, and if so, how, or if they would not resist. Well, I get the notion that all of you have thought that through somewhat, and that's why you're here. And we certainly support your prerogative, your right to defend yourself, and we would like to aid you by getting some knowledge and some skills in your hands so that you can do that and do that effectively. We don't urge that everybody pack a gun, but we do say that anybody who wants to in Montana and has adequate training to do it, which you will receive today, should be allowed to, and that's a perfectly acceptable alternative for providing for your own personal protection. So we want to get these skills and this knowledge into your hands so that you can make that choice not to be a victim. And I think you'll find by the end of the day that you are substantially empowered, and that's really why those of us who give up our weekend time to be able to do this, because we want to be able to see you empowered to make that choice. There are, of course, other reasons why people own firearms. There are people who collect little colored pieces of paper with glue on one side and a picture on the other and can spend a lot of money on it, and that's not why I'd spend my money, but really that's their choice if they want to do it. There's people who collect guns for the same reasons. They just like to look at them and have them, and maybe there's people certainly who collect firearms as an investment, and they're a pretty good investment because they generally don't lose value over a period of time. Of course, Montana is a place known for hunting, and a lot of us hunt. We've heard ladies here talk about hunting. I hunt. My passion is hunting elk with a revolver. I hunt elk with a pistol. And so that's a perfectly reasonable reason to own firearms. There are lots of people who shoot competitively in Montana. I do that too. I shoot a couple different disciplines in competition, and that's a good reason to own a firearm. I'm not sure, like coming to the class, I'm not sure you really have to have any approved reason to own a firearm, but there are plenty of reasons. And matter of fact, this is probably a good time to mention firearms density in Montana. I heard a number of you talk about, you live in Montana, households in Montana have guns, and you should be prepared to know how to handle them safely. I think that's a good idea. But how many households in Montana contain firearms? Well, we estimate that over 90% of the households in Montana contain firearms. We will talk later about kids and gun safety. I've heard people in Montana say, well, we don't have any guns in our house, so our kids don't need to know about gun safety. And I always say, excuse me, over 90% of the households in Montana contain firearms, and your kids certainly play at somebody else's house, and you don't know what those people's gun safety protocols and habits may be, and so it's much better for your kid to be playing at other people's houses, knowing something about don't touch, tell an adult kind of gun safety message, rather than just ignoring it. So we estimate that between 90 and 95% of the households in Montana contain firearms. I don't think that shocks you, but the next number is going to kind of shock you. I have done a lot of research into especially kid gun accidents in Montana, and have found that although we have a lot of firearms in Montana, we have about 40% of the national rate of misadventures with guns that kids have nationwide. And the reason for that is because guns are a part of our culture. But I've always wondered how much a part of our culture. We know the NRA estimates about 50% of the national households contain firearms, and of those households that contain firearms, each gun-owning household has an average of 2 firearms. And I've wondered how many guns in each home in Montana. Well, if somebody were to call me on the phone and ask me how many guns you have in your home, I'd be hard-pressed to be so polite as to simply hang up on them. We will talk about privacy a little bit later and how you can respond to some of these kind of questions, but the answer is we all like to be a little private about our gun ownership. So it's hard to get at that kind of data. Well, I have been in some meetings, a number of meetings of people who are known sportsmen who are known to be in that 90-95% group. And I've passed out little slips of paper. I said, I want you to write something on a slip of paper. I want you to write the number of guns in your home. I don't want you to write any names or makes or models or your address or your phone number or anything else, just that number, and pass them in, and I'll shuffle them, and then I'll keep a running average. And I have kept that running average over a period of 3 or 4 meetings where I have done this. Anybody want to guess what the average number of firearms per Montana home is? Tracy says? 5. 5? I'm glad you're all sitting down, Tracy. You might want to get a stool. 27. 27. So if your husbands complain that they're substandard, you'll know why. Average. Average.
In the guns that own houses?
Yeah, in the
houses where guns are?
Yes. Average. Some they're less. I mean, there's some in the 5-10 range, and anyway, there are lots of guns in Montana. The point is there are lots of guns, yet we still have about 40% the national average incidence of misadventures with firearms, and that's because of the gun culture in Montana and the fact that knowing about guns and gun safety and taking gun safety classes, stuff like that, is very much part of the Montana culture. Last December, I had to take a trip to Texas. I manufacture shooting range equipment for law enforcement agencies nationwide, and I went down to the Texas Tactical Officers Association in Dallas to show my equipment. Before I left here, I called my tire dealer and I said, look, I have to go to Texas and back. Do you think I should take my studded snow tires off and put my highway tires on? And he said, no, you might run into a snowstorm coming back into Montana. You might need them, might as well run them. They won't take that much wear. And so I did, and I got down there while I was in Dallas. They had a big snowstorm, okay? And, I mean, traffic was stalled, absolutely stopped everywhere. There were wrecks all over the place. It was a mess. I was fine. I had four-wheel drive instead of snow tires. I was unencumbered. And that brought to my mind this issue of culture. And in Montana, we drive in those kind of conditions all the time, every year. And we learn how to handle it and learn how to handle it safely. And we don't have a fraction of the wrecks they had down there the one time they had that snowstorm. And that's why we have, despite the fact that we have so many guns in our households in our state, why we have less misadventures with firearms than in other places. Well, let's ask, who's allowed to own a firearm in Montana? I remember when I was in the Army, I got to fire what's called a quad 50 machine gun, which is 4 50 caliber machine guns all pointing in the same direction. You sit in kind of a sling seat, and it electrically rotates like this and elevates like this, and when you press the button, all 4 machine guns start firing at the same time. And that was a lot of fun to shoot. We shot it all one afternoon, destroyed a bunch of old car bodies out on the range. But are you allowed to own one of those? I see a lot of heads going like this. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You can own one in Montana. I know some people in Montana who do. You have to pay a federal $200 transfer tax on each one, and because federal law has limited the number of those in civilian ownership and affected supply and demand, they are very expensive to buy and they're expensive to feed. But you can own them as long as you don't have a felony record and you get the approval of the local sheriff that you don't have a criminal record, or the chief of police. Really, in answer to the question who's allowed to own firearms in Montana, basically every law-abiding adult can buy whatever firearms they want, and do often. Certainly our right to keep and bear arms, our right to own firearms in Montana is protected by both the federal and the state constitution. You've heard about the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and you may have also heard the argument, well, gosh, you know, we really don't know what that means because it was enacted a long time ago, and you know, there have been different opinions, and the Supreme Court has never ruled on it, and other kinds of excuses. Well, excuse me, we do know what it means. You remember the Second Amendment is an amendment. It wasn't part of the original Constitution. It was sent out as a part of the Bill of the Rights to all the states for their ratification. And in the state legislatures, when they were debating the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, they wrote the debates down. They recorded what people said. And, for example, Patrick Henry said in the Virginia Assembly that the great purpose of the Second Amendment is that every man be armed. And he meant every person. He meant ladies, too. But that everybody should be able to own firearms that were contemporary to their times. Well, so the Second Amendment, I would argue, clearly protects your right to own whatever firearms you want. And in the Montana Constitution, Article 1 is our compact with the United States. So the Constitution really begins at Article 2. And Article 2 in the Montana Constitution is called our Declaration of Rights. And it is essentially the equivalent of the Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution. And it is the portion of the Constitution that secures all these individual rights. At Article 2, Section 12, is our right to keep and bear arms. And you read it in the lethal force, allowable use of lethal force publication. And it clearly reserves to every individual an individual right to possess whatever firearms they want. So our ability to possess firearms in Montana is protected both by the federal Constitution and the Montana Constitution. There are some states in America that have adopted a lot of laws that infringe on their right to keep and bear arms, unfortunately, but in Montana we're doing pretty well, in part thanks to the Montana Shooting Sports Association. But, for example, there are no state laws that regulate the ownership of machine guns, except that it's a crime to commit a crime with one. There is that law left on the books. And Montana really probably has the fewest laws regulating the ownership and use of firearms of any of the states of the United States. And there's some national authorities who have said that. That may be, as a matter of fact, one national authority a guy by the name of Dave Koppel, who's an attorney with the Independence Institute in Golden, Colorado, says that Montana is, from the perspective of gun rights and gun ownership, is the freest place in the world, because America is the best in the world in terms of gun laws, and Montana is the best in America. So we live in a climate where you are relatively unrestrained about owning and using firearms. We will talk more a little bit later about some of the restraints that would go on, the concealed weapon laws, allowable uses of lethal force, and some other things like that. But you live in a climate where it's okay, it's culturally acceptable, it's legally easy and okay for you to own and use firearms. There are some types of restrictions on the use of firearms in Montana. My 13-year-old boy will be so glad when he has a birthday in a month, because there is a law that says that a child under 14 may not be in possession of a firearm unless they're under adult supervision. And so now he can, when he has my permission, can take his shotgun and go grouse hunting once he's 14 and be legal in doing that. There are rules, hunting rules, for example, that have the force of law, like you may not fire onto, from, or across a public roadway. There's a state law that says you may not discharge a firearm inside the city limits unless you're doing that to defend yourself. And some of these laws are mentioned in the publications that you have read before you came to the class. But certainly our limitations on owning firearms under state law are very few. We will talk at some length about the concealed weapon laws and concealed weapon permits a little bit later, but there are laws about that. And I should note that where the Montana Constitution says that we have the right to bear arms, they say that this constitutional right does not apply to carrying concealed weapons. That's clearly spelled out in the Montana Constitution, so that reservation of a constitutional right does not extend to carrying concealed weapons. That doesn't mean we're not allowed to carry concealed weapons in Montana. It just means it's not a constitutional right. And that comes from that era in 1889 when the Montana Constitution was adopted, when it was not socially acceptable to carry concealed weapons. I figure if you were going to carry a gun, you ought to carry it out in the open where everybody can see it. And that was the culture at the time. I do want to talk about privacy a bit. I told you before we would be respectful of your privacy. Privacy is important to gun owners, and I think you've heard that before from others. That's another part of our culture. And there are reasons why. There's a very great gun advocacy group in Wisconsin called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. And they're a very staunch pro-gun group, and I like a lot of the stuff they've done. But one of the things they've done is they've gone back and researched what they call lethal laws. And they have documented that in the 1900s, in this past century, there were approximately 180 million people murdered by their own governments all over the world. We've heard about the Nazi Holocaust in World War II Germany, where between 8 and 12 million Jews were exterminated by the German government. That's very famous. You haven't heard so much about the purges in Russia and China, in Southeast Asia and Africa. But 180 million people in that century were killed by their own governments. Many fewer than that were killed in warfare. Many fewer. I don't know what the numbers are in warfare, but it's on the order of 4 or 5 million maybe. But there are a lot of people who just lined up mass graves and shot and pushed in the graves by their own governments. Well, what the Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership learned through their scholarly research was that in every one of those genocides, first, there were laws passed to require people to register their firearms. And in every case they said, well, you know, we have crime and we need to know who has the guns so the criminals can't get them, so if all you good people will just register your guns, then we'll know where they are and we'll be able to control crime better. And then later they came along with another law that said, well, in order to fight crime, we really need to make sure that there aren't any guns out there for criminals to get, so all you people who've registered your guns are going to have to turn them in. And when the Nazis came for the Jews, they had no way to defend themselves. And the same was true in all the other Holocausts that happened. The genocides that happened in this last century is they were all perpetrated against people who were disarmed, and they had no way to resist. Well, I'm not saying that every time there's gun registration that absolutely leads to genocide, but I am saying that every genocide that happened, according to JPFO, in the last century, happened to people who had been disarmed by their governments. So in Montana, our gun owners in America, all over America, are sensitive to being on lists that cause them to be registered as, or thought of, known as gun owners. And we understand that, and so I want to assure you that the fact that you've attended this class, we treat that information with great confidentiality. I do rarely send out a newsletter to IHW graduates, and as an example, I had urged the classes of early IHW students to form an organization of class graduates in order to facilitate more advanced training, ongoing education, and also to provide something of a built-in support group should any of the ladies graduates ever have to use lethal force. And finally, they did get together and decided to form an organization. It's now formed, I'll talk about it later, called the Montana Women Shooting Association. And they said, okay, Gary, we're ready to start this organization. Give us the list so we can mail to the ladies. And I said, yeah, right. Like, I'm going to give you the list. They said, well, how can we form an organization? You want us to form an organization? Give us the list. And I said, no. I told you in the class, we don't release the names of IH graduates to anybody for any reason at all. End of story. They said, well, how can we form this organization if you won't give us the list? I said, I'll tell you how many envelopes to prepare. You put all the stuff in and put postage on them. You give them to me. I'll put the labels on them, stick them in the mail. And that's how we did it. It works fine. But I just want to assure you in this conversation about privacy, that's just an example of how seriously we take it. And we don't release your names to anybody for any reason. And you will understand now, I hope, why there is this sense of privacy in the gun culture. There is another side to that argument that I'd be glad to tell you about, and that is because we estimate that up to 95% of the households in Montana contain firearms. If they were wanting to round up the gun owners in Montana, they would round up everybody, right? And they would be more accurate about getting all the gun owners than they would be in Illinois, where they have serious gun registration and gun owner registration. So there is that other side to the coin, and I don't mean to wax totally paranoid about it, but we do have this sense of privacy, and MSSA respects your privacy. Let's talk about ammunition. That's where I get to exercise my artistry skills. I shoot better than I draw. A round of ammunition looks something like this. It has several components. The package that holds it all together is called the brass. That's this part here. And it's literally made of brass in most cases, sometimes made of aluminum, sometimes made of steel, but usually made of brass. It's important for that material to be used because it's flexible, will expand when the round goes off, and seize to the inside of the chamber of the firearm and hold everything in place while the powder's burning and the bullet's leaving the round of ammunition. The part in the front that actually goes out of the gun down range or forward is the bullet. There are lots of different kinds of bullets. We'll talk about those in a minute. Inside the brass is the gunpowder, and in the back of the brass is a primer, a priming compound of some sort. And it's important to note that the only part of this round of ammunition that is explosive is the priming compound and the primer. By explosive, I mean when it lights all at once. And it has to be that way. In between the primer and the powder, there's what's called a flash hole, where the fire from the primer, when it lights, can light the powder. The powder burns, and let me pass around some examples of some of this. Here are some expended primers that I'll pass around for you to look at. These have come out of rounds of ammunition that have been fired, so they are now inert. It's important to firearms that powder burn at a controlled rate. In the 1800s, they used a kind of powder called black powder, and black powder is explosive. That means that when it goes all at once. And I don't know if you remember, I remember from my childhood seeing the movies where the bad guys would bring the keg of gunpowder set it beside the walls of the fort and light a little fuse and run away and blow up, and the walls of the fort would fall down, and they'd go in and get the gold or whatever. That's black powder. It does explode. But smokeless powder, modern smokeless powder, was invented in the last half of the 1800s and is now what is used most commonly in firearms. There are still people who shoot black powder firearms. Actually, I have a cannon that shoots black powder. It's powered by black powder. It's fun. It's a bore about this big. We use it on 4th of July. But modern firearms, and the ones you're here to learn about, use what's called smokeless powder. Smokeless powder not only doesn't produce much smoke, but also burns the powder at a controlled rate, and that's important for how it's applied in the firearm. For firearms like rifles that have a long barrel, you have powder that burns much more slowly because it needs to keep building pressure as the bullet travels down the barrel and keep accelerating the bullet all the way until it leaves the muzzle. But for the kind of firearms that you might use for personal protection with a barrel about this long, all the powder needs to be burned by the time the bullet leaves the end of the barrel. And the way they control the burning rate is partly by the chemical makeup of the powder, but also more by the size and shape of the powder granules. For a slow-burning rifle powder, they're big chunks, relatively big chunks. They're rod-shaped pieces of powder, and you know that if you burning a fire in your fireplace and you put a big log on the fire, it takes a long time for it to burn from the outside to the inside until it's consumed. Whereas if you throw a bunch of little sticks of kindling on the fire, they'll burn very quickly, burn right away, and it won't last very long. Well, the same applies to gunpowder when it's burning. And I'll pass two samples around. The first sample is a slow-burning rifle powder, and you see it's fairly coarse rod-shaped granules. The other is a fast-burning pistol powder, and it's little flat saucer-shaped pieces that you can imagine would be like the kindling you throw on the fire that would burn very quickly from the outside to the inside because it's not very far from the outside to the inside. But I think what we're most concerned about, what we're most interested in here, are the bullets. Somebody once said, if you get shot, it's the bullet that kills you, not the gunpowder. Actually, there are others who say it's not the bullet, it's the hole. Well, we'll get back to that. Let me pass around an empty brass so you can see what the brass looks like and how the primer sits in the back of it. You can look inside it and actually see this flash hole where the primer communicates its explosion to the powder. There are a lot of different kinds of bullets available for different kinds of purposes depending on what you want to do. For practice ammunition, commonly cast bullets are used. They're cast out of a lead alloy. There's tin and antimony mixed with the lead to harden it. And I'm going to pass around a couple samples of cast bullets. One is a round nose. The other is a semi-wad cutter. It's called a wad cutter because they cut nice crisp circles out of the paper when you shoot them through paper, and they're used for practice and shooting competition. You notice both of these have a little blue band around them. That's wax, a form of wax that's in there to act as a lubricant on the inside of the barrel and to prevent the lead from sticking to the inside of the barrel. Those are not the bullets you would be most likely to use for personal protection. Here I will pass around also a full metal jacket bullet. I have some other examples of full metal jacket bullets here. Let me dump all my samples out here so I can pick what I want and pass them around. These full metal jacket bullets are very standard ammunition. In the military, they use all full metal jacket bullets, but those are generally a copper jacket around a lead bullet. And the copper helps prevent lead from sticking to the bore and allows the bullet to be driven with hotter, faster powder. What you want to do, however, with personal protection, we'll talk about a little bit later, is you want stopping power. You want to deliver the energy of the bullet to the target and stop the assault. One of the ways to do that is have a bullet that opens up and gets wider when it hits the target. And those are available, and they're called hollow point bullets. When we're at the range this afternoon, we will do some demonstrations of some different kinds of ammo that I think you'll find very impressive. That'll show you the difference between how a solid point or a round nose jacketed bullet performs compared to a hollow point. But what happens when a hollow point strikes a target is they open up and flatten out, so they have a broader front to the bullet and deliver their energy on target better because they have a broader front. I told you that I go to law enforcement conferences, and there was a vendor there of the body armor that law enforcement wear to prevent them from, stop a bullet that hits them. And the vendor threw one of his, not bulletproof, but bullet-resistant vests on the ground, said, does anybody have any ammunition they want to shoot into this vest and try it? And I said, sure, I'll try it. And I had these bullets that I use for hunting deer, by the way, with 45 auto, the big hollow cavity, big hollow point bullet, and I fired one of them into this vest. And it turned out to be a very good example of mushrooming. That's what it's called when the bullet spreads out like this, is mushrooming. And if you wonder why this mushroom bullet has fabric marks on the front of it, it's not because the deer I shoot are wearing clothing nowadays. It's because I fired this bullet into that bullet-resistant vest. So this is the same bullet mushroomed out and fired into a Kevlar vest. No, stopped it. No, those vests are guaranteed to stop certain, the vests are rated at different levels of protection depending on what kind of bullet they're guaranteed to stop. You'll see at the range this afternoon I'm wearing a firearms instructor range vest that's guaranteed to stop .44 Magnum. Doesn't mean I'm inviting anybody to test the vest. There was an effort a number of years ago by the people who advocate gun control to ban a whole lot of ammunition. And the ammunition they wanted to ban they called cop killer bullets. And they said that it was any bullet that would penetrate a level 2 body armor that law enforcement wear. Well, excuse me, any rifle bullet will do that. Penetration of body armor is dependent largely on velocity and not on the size of the bullet. And so the effect, had they been able to get that law through Congress, would have been, in the guise of banning cop killer bullets, would have been to ban all the ammunition that we used to hunt deer and elk with, and most of the ammunition is used for rifle sporting, shooting, and lots of other stuff. And that was their intent. They were hoping nobody would pick up on that. Well, we knew better. And so there really isn't such a thing as particular cop killer bullets. There is such a thing as armor-piercing ammunition. It's not very common. It's legal to own. But it's a copper jacket over a hardened tungsten steel core that's used by the military to penetrate vehicles and other kinds of metal. And I have an example I'll pass around to show you. It's legal to own, legal to use, and legal to shoot, but there's not much call for it in civilian life. But this is an armor-piercing bullet, fairly rare, and I have cut the front of the jacket away so you can see the steel core that's inside it. Okay. Let's talk about different firearm types for a little bit. What we're really here to talk about today are handguns, and that's what we'll be spending most of our time about. Let's talk first about revolvers. Revolvers are a kind of firearm that hold their ammunition in a cylinder that goes around and around. I have some real ones I will use to demonstrate with, and I have some toys. The toys are here, the real ones over there. So if you see me pick a gun up here like this, these are all toys, albeit maybe very realistic looking. In any case, see how this has this cylinder in here that rolls around like so. Revolvers all have that, and that's a way that you can put multiple rounds in there, and when the next round is needed, it rolls up so it's in line with the hammer and in line with the bore. There are two different kinds of revolvers. They're basically old kinds and new kinds. The old kind are called single-action revolvers because there's only one way to make them work. This is an example of a single-action revolver. It's the kind that were used in the Old West, and they didn't call them single-action revolvers then because they didn't have another kind to compare them with. But with a single-action revolver, the only way you can make them work is to cock the hammer and then shoot. And if you don't cock the hammer first, you can pull the trigger as much as you want and nothing is going to happen. However, in the end of the 1800s, they developed a kind of revolver called a double-action revolver. And there are two ways to make them shoot. One is to cock the hammer, just like a single-action revolver, and squeeze the trigger. The other is to just squeeze the trigger. And that cocks the hammer and rotates the cylinder and gets it ready to shoot. And then when the trigger comes all the way back, the gun will go bang. For those of you who are shooting revolvers at the range today, we will recommend that you shoot them only double-action. Most of you, it's very rare for us to have people come who have only single-action revolvers. So if you have a double-action revolver, we would like you, for personal protection purposes, not to learn to cock the hammer and then squeeze the trigger. And we'll talk more about this in considerable detail. With a single-action revolver, usually the loading is done through something called a loading gate in the back of what the back of the gun is called the recoil shield. With a double-action revolver, and again, we'll talk more about this later, the cylinder swings out like so that you can actually get out the cylinder for loading and unloading. The other kind of firearms that were invented right at the end of the 1800s are called auto-loaders, and they're called auto-loaders because each time a round is fired, they reload themselves. They have ammunition that's carried in a magazine or a clip that goes into the grip of the firearm, and then each time you squeeze the trigger and it goes bang, the force of the projectile going out the front, if for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It pushes the slide back like this. When the slide comes back, it pulls the empty out of the chamber, throws it out, and then the spring on the magazine pushes the next round up. So when the spring on the slide comes forward, it strips that round off top of the magazine and loads it in the chamber, and it's ready to shoot again. And so they're called autoloaders or semi-auto pistols. So every time you squeeze the trigger, they go bang, they reload themselves, and they're ready to shoot again. As you can imagine, that provides some additional safety considerations that you will need to know about in using these kind of firearms, and we will cover that in detail in a little while. By the way, semi-auto pistols often have some kind of external safety, a lever that you can move to render, theoretically, the firearm inoperable. We will talk in the next item we talk about, after we talk about different firearm types, will be safe gun handling, and we will tell you don't rely on this manual safety for the safety of your firearm. That's not the primary safety. The primary safety is you, the gun owner or the gun handler. Another kind of firearm which we all know about are rifles. They are longer, they're shoulder mounted, often have telescopic sights. They're intended for shooting more accurately at a long distance, for hunting, for whatever, but to deliver a bullet at a longer distance. They're called rifles because they have grooves cut down the inside of the barrel called rifling that impart a spin to the bullet. Actually, a normal hunting rifle imparts a considerable spin to the bullet. You know, the engine on your car will turn over 3,000, 5,000 RPM. Your electric drill will rotate 3,000 to 5,000 RPM, depending on the drill, maybe less. By comparison, a rifle bullet coming out of a rifle barrel will be turning anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 RPM. They really spin really fast. There's interesting discussion about that we can talk about during lunchtime if you want. But pistols also have rifle, and the purpose of the spin, by the way, is to stabilize the bullet in flight, so it'll go straight. And pistols also have rifling cut in the barrel, and this is a pistol barrel taken out of a gun, and I'll pass it around, and you can look at the light through it, and you can see the rifling grooves cut on the inside of the barrel. Shotguns are smoothbores. They do not have rifling in them, and they're used to throw a cloud of little round lead balls called lead shot, or steel shot nowadays for hunting waterfowl and other applications. Shotguns are usually used for sporting purposes. They do have an application for personal protection. If you have a handgun that you're used to and practiced with, and you're thinking about a second firearm possibly for home defense, there are some shotguns that are made just for home defense, and they're very intimidating. So that might be something you want to look into later, but something we're not going to cover in any detail here. The reason they're smoothbores is because if you have this cloud of lead shot coming out of the barrel and it's spinning, the centrifugal force makes it go like this, and it doesn't stay together as it travels downrange. So it's better if it's a smoothbore, so the cloud will pretty much hold together as it goes downrange. The last kind of firearms I want to talk about are a media invention called assault weapons. And assault rifles are something that looks bad, generally are black, generally have synthetic stocks, generally are semi-auto and have a detachable magazine that holds the ammunition, and look so mean and evil that they, according to the media and the gun control people, warrant a separate kind of term to describe them, called assault rifles. And I brought one for you to look at. We may even have a chance to shoot it at the range today. This is an AR, automatic rifle with telescoping stock. It is, this is the same firearm used by the U.S. military, except in the military they have a selector switch so they can shoot full auto, which means as long as you have the trigger back, it'll keep firing until it runs out of ammo. This one is perfectly legal to own. It's a semi-auto, which means every time you want it to go bang, you have to pull the trigger. And I want to explain to you that often when you hear talk about these in the media, they'll talk about them as powerful assault weapons. Well, excuse me. The cartridge the military used to use in World War I and World War II is 30-06. You hear that spoken of commonly because it's a very common hunting caliber, the cartridge, a very common hunting cartridge. What the military learned is that if you shoot an enemy soldier and you kill him, you take one person out of combat. If you shoot the enemy soldier and you wound him, you take 4 or 5 people out of combat. So they went to a different cartridge, this one. right here. This little one. This little one is what this shoots and what the standard military ammunition is nowadays. It's a bullet about half the size of the other, a quarter of the weight. Uses about a quarter of the powder, and you can see the brass is much smaller. It's not all that powerful, and it is not powerful by design, because what they want to do nowadays is to wound the enemy soldier and get all these other people to have to take care of him, to take more people out of combat. So I want to explain to you that these guns they call assault weapons are really not as powerful as the media would sometime lead you to believe. And that little tiny round of ammunition doesn't have much recoil, and so it makes guns like this kind of fun to shoot. So we may have a chance to play with this at the range today if we have time. Questions about different firearm types? Okay, one more block of discussion and then we'll have a break. If you forget everything else you learn in this class, you need to remember this part of the class. This is the rules about safe gun handling, safety rules. You know, we read in the media about people who have accidents with firearms, and it happens, unfortunately. Accidents, by definition, are preventable. But when they happen, it's because people thought that they could get away with disregarding one of these rules, or they spaced the rules out or something, but they didn't attend to these rules. Number one rule of gun safety is all guns are loaded. It doesn't matter how recently you've checked them, who else has checked them, what you think about them. You treat every gun as if it's loaded all the time. As a matter of fact, I don't distinguish a lot in the guns in my home between what guns are loaded and what guns are unloaded. I don't make a big project or a big deal out of keeping guns unloaded, because I treat them as if they're all loaded, and I know that I'll never get lackadaisical as long as I know that some of them are loaded, and any of them could be loaded, and probably are. And but you always hear it's the unloaded gun that somebody thought was unloaded that injures somebody. It's because the people who are handling the gun ignored this rule. They think that they're smarter than the laws of nature, and they can pretend that some guns are unloaded, and it's just not true. You have to treat every gun as if it's loaded all the time. The second rule of gun safety is muzzle direction. Don't ever allow the muzzle, the bore, to line up with anything you aren't willing to destroy or you don't intend to destroy. You've noticed when I've been handling guns up here, I've been very careful with muzzle direction, and I haven't pointed any guns at any of you, and if anybody points any guns at you, they have put you at risk. And you should feel free to say something about it, hopefully in a tactful way, but if not, whatever way you want to do it. The place where people violate this rule in ways that will drive you crazy, unfortunately, are at sporting goods stores. And if you're in sporting goods stores, people are looking at guns. Sheila's going like this. You ladies, when you leave this class, you will be very well trained in safe gun handling. And we will enforce this kind of stuff at the range so that you will develop exceptional gun safety, gun handling habits. That's good. We like that. But that means that it's going to make it a little frustrating for you when you're in places where people are not trained to the level of safety that you are. Sometimes you have to kind of grit your teeth and put up with it. Frankly, I don't spend a lot of time in the sporting goods stores because I find it frustrating that people there are as casual with muzzle direction as they are. The third rule of gun safety is finger out of the trigger guard. Always keep your finger out of the trigger guard until you're lined up and ready to shoot. The place for your finger on revolvers and semi-autos is above the trigger guard on the frame, just like that. And it doesn't, if you need to use the firearm, it doesn't take you very long to bring your finger down and put it on the trigger. As a matter of fact, let me tell you how long it takes you. I was at the Washington State Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors Association annual training conference last summer, and they had a big argument going because the head of the academy in Washington, of the State Law Enforcement Academy, had adopted a policy that if a law enforcement officer has reason to get his gun out, he should have his finger in the trigger guard and on the trigger, because otherwise he could get shot for being unable to respond quickly enough. The Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors Association over there said, no, this is bad policy. People's fingers should always be outside the trigger guard, as I'm telling you, until it's time, until they're ready, they have sights lined up and they're ready to shoot. And so these guys were talking about this controversy, And I said, I can resolve this for you. And they said, how can you do that? And I said, when we shoot in competition, we use something called a shot timer. It's an electronic device that gives a start signal, electronic start signal, when you push a button. And then it has ears listen and hear each shot and records each shot to the nearest hundredth of a second. So I took one of the guys, one of the instructors, over to the bay where I was using for my event. And they said, okay, I want you to get your gun out, point it downrange, load it up, and when I give you the start signal with a shot timer, I want you to start first with your finger outside the trigger guard like this. And every time you hear the start signal, I want you to put your finger in the trigger guard and squeeze off a shot as quickly as you can. And so we did that with 5 shots and wrote down the times. And then I said, okay, now I want you to put your finger in the trigger guard on the trigger and do the same thing 5 times. Whenever you hear the beep of the start signal, fire off a shot. And so we did. And we averaged the times, finger out of the trigger guard and finger in the trigger guard, and then we subtracted the average of one from the other. And that gave us the amount of time it takes to get the finger from the frame into the trigger guard. Anybody want to guess how long it takes, how much longer it takes if you start with your finger out of the trigger guard? 0.05 of a second. 0.05 of a second. No time at all. No time at all in a personal protection situation. Not enough to be concerned about. So don't believe it if somebody says you have to have your finger on the trigger or you're not ready to shoot. Certainly, once you get the gun out lined up and you have your target acquired, then you can put your finger in the trigger guard on the trigger when you're ready to shoot. But until then, and we will enforce this at the range, until you're ready to squeeze off the shot, every time your finger belongs on the frame above the trigger guard, outside the trigger guard. Also, of course, another rule of gun safety, I think of it as kind of a second echelon. The first 3 are the first 3, and they're the most important ever. But you also should make sure of your target. Make sure in every case that your target is a shoot target, not some child wandering around the house in the middle of the night looking for a glass of water. And you have to make sure that what's beyond your target is safe as well. You look out your back door and there's a mountain lion standing on a swing set in the backyard. You need to notice before you plug the mountain lion that the next yard over or the next yard over that doesn't have kids playing in it or something like that. You have to make sure that everything is safe downrange for as far as your bullet can travel, and with a handgun you can figure on a mile. You also need a safe place in your house to check your firearms, load it, unload it, clean it, practice, stuff like that. They say in the gun-owning community there are 2 kinds of people. There are those who have had an accidental discharge, and there are those who are going to have an accidental discharge. Okay, so the point is that when you have your accidental discharge, which hopefully you'll prevent for a long time, that it go in a safe direction where nobody's going to get injured. If it takes out a window, I don't much care. You can replace the window. If it takes out your TV, big deal, as long as it doesn't injure another person or a pet. So you need a safe place in your house where if you should have your accidental discharge, it's going to be in a safe direction. It's not going to go through a light wall and injure somebody in the next room. It's not going to go out of your house and into the neighbor's house and injure somebody over there. So what kind of things do you have in your house that will stop a bullet? Well, if you have a full concrete basement, for example, concrete walls all the way around the outside will stop the bullet. So suppose this were an exterior wall in the basement, you could always use that as a safe direction to check your loads, to dry fire practice, which means shooting without ammunition, we'll talk about that, or to clean your gun, to unload it and load it, whatever. That would be a safe direction. And I should answer the question which somebody might ask, and that is, suppose you hit a concrete wall with a bullet. What's going to happen to the bullet? Is it going to bounce around like a billiard ball? And the answer is no. I don't know if you remember seeing the old David Crockett movie where he went in was showing off his marksmanship in the bar, and he put the muzzle and rifle over his shoulder, looked in the mirror, and aimed at a frying pan across here and squeezed it off, and it bounced off the frying pan and off a lamp over there and off a chimney over here, and then he caught the bullet in his teeth, right? Doesn't work like that. Sorry. When bullets hit a hard surface, they behave very much like a water balloon would behave if you threw it hard at that surface. That is, a bullet fired at a concrete wall like this will splatter down along the wall, but it won't bounce here, bounce over there, bounce over there. So what you should, if you're pointing at this concrete wall that's in your basement, you should be pointing perpendicular to the wall. So if you have your accidental discharge, the bullet will splatter like this a little bit and won't skitter along the wall. So where else in your house could you designate as a safe gun handling place? Any masonry structure, like a fireplace or a brick wall, will stop a bullet. Even cinder block, generally, with the kind of guns you use for personal protection, will stop a bullet. If you live out in the country like I do, I can point at any window or any wall and know that that's a safe direction because there's nobody there. And if a bullet were to escape the house, it wouldn't injure anybody. But where you live may have a greater challenge than that. And you'll just have to look around. A heavy cast iron frying pan would probably stop a bullet. So if you have one of those hanging on a wall, that would be a place where you could point your gun when you're loading and unloading, where if you have an AD, it would stop the bullet. A stove, a refrigerator, I wouldn't count on those stopping a bullet because they're made of, actually constructed of very light materials. A microwave, don't count on it. But there's one place which you all have in your house that will stop a bullet if you don't have any other place, and that's your closet. All your clothes hanging in your closet would capture a bullet. Not if you're shooting perpendicular to the closet rod. If the closet rod is like this, with all the clothes hanging down like so, and you have an accidental discharge, it'll whistle right through there and won't stop the bullet. But if the closet rod looks like this on the end with the hangers hanging like so and the clothes hanging down like this, and a bullet goes in this way, it'll go about 3 or 4 layers of clothing deep, but it will stop the bullet. You'll have a little mending to do. So if one of the places which you might need to choose for your gun handling in your home, that would be a safe place, would be is if you can get on end to one of your closets, even if it's through the wall. You say you're out in the hallway outside your bedroom, and you know your closet is right in here. You may want to hang a picture on the wall here that can be your standard picture to use to look at when you're dry firing or loading your gun or whatever. Question?
What about over your bed?
What about over your bed?
I mean, if it would accidentally discharge over your bed.
You mean down into your bed?
Two mattresses.
Yeah, well, the lower one is usually a box spring, and they're mostly air and hollow. I wouldn't count on that. If you had a basement underneath and you knew there was nobody down there, that might be, that's a possibility. Let's talk for a moment about dry fire practice. Dry firing means shooting without ammunition. And it's good practice, and you should do it. But you should make sure your gun is unloaded, of course, before you do your dry fire practice. There's some question about what guns you can dry fire. Let me give you some rules of thumb. Guns made before 1950, don't dry fire them unless you ask a gunsmith or somebody knowledgeable about that particular gun. Guns that are rimfire, I guess I didn't talk about rimfires, but 22, we all heard about 22 ammo. It has the priming compound. It doesn't have a separate primer. It has a priming compound inside the rim of the brass. And generally speaking, don't dry fire a 22 or a rimfire unless you know that it's that particular gun is going to be okay. All other guns, centerfire guns made since 1950, generally speaking, you can dry fire them as much as you want with total impunity. They're made to take it, and it won't harm them. If you have questions about it, look at your owner's manual, ask your gunsmith or whatever, but those are the general rules. For example, this is a revolver. Excuse me for turning my back to you, Tracy, but I like to turn this way with the gun so we're not violating the muzzle direction rule here. This is a double-action revolver. I shoot sometimes in competition, and I have probably dry fired this 100,000 times in dry fire practice. And it's okay because it's a modern firearm and it will take it. The older guns. Yeah, the older guns. Because they can be designed internally in such a way that the uncushioned fall of the hammer can actually accelerate the wear on the gun. You can buy some stuff that looks like ammunition that's not, called snap caps, that you load in your gun that will absorb the impact of the fall of the hammer if you want to be especially kind to your gun, or if you have an older one that shouldn't be fired empty. Yes, ma'am.
What was the year again for the gun?
Approximately 1950, the middle of the last century. Questions about the rules of gun safety. I want to go over them one more time. The first rule of gun safety is all guns are loaded. Every gun is loaded. Doesn't matter who else checked it. If somebody unloads a gun and looks at it and says this gun is unloaded and hands it to you, first thing you should do is check it to make sure it's unloaded and then treat it as if it were a loaded gun. Okay? The second rule of gun safety is muzzle direction. Never let the bore of the gun line up with anything you aren't willing to destroy. And if anybody should be so careless with a firearm as to sweep you with it, they have done something very rude and dangerous. At the range, we will talk about sweeping yourself. We will talk in the draw about how you always want to have your weak hand covering your navel so that you're not reaching over here on your holster. I'll demonstrate with my Leatherman here if I can get it open. If you come out, if you're putting your gun away and you go like this, you've just pointed the gun at yourself. Okay, even if it's your fingertips, you have pointed a gun at yourself. We think pointing guns at yourself is not a good idea. So we will discipline you for that. But muzzle direction is the second most important rule. Third rule is keep your finger out of the trigger guard. Keep your finger out of the trigger guard until your sights are lined up and you've identified the target and you're ready to shoot. I was hired as an expert witness by the manufacturer Glock about 2 years ago to testify at a civil trial. There was a 14-year-old boy up in the Big Fork area who was home alone one afternoon with a 14-year-old friend, and they picked up his dad's 10-millimeter Glock, and he pointed at his friend and pulled the trigger and killed him. Yeah, right. Did he violate any gun safety rules? Yeah, he violated all of them, and that was my testimony. Was that it wasn't the gun's fault. The gun did everything it was supposed to do, exactly the way it was supposed to do it. It was the fault of the parents for leaving the kids home unsupervised, for leaving the guns accessible, and for not having imparted the necessary safety training to the kids, and the fault of the kid for having violated all three rules, important rules about gun safety. So I want those three rules about gun safety to be etched in your brains, please. That's the most important part of this class, and we will talk more about those. We will enforce those at the range, so you get used not only to knowing them intellectually, but performing and using them. Questions about the rules about gun safety? Now we will take a 10-minute break, but I want to tell you before we do take a break, I brought some guns for you to look at here, and many of them will be available if you want to try them at the range. On the back row up against the wall are guns that I think are not suitable for personal protection for one reason or another, and we'll talk about why later. On the front row out like this, there are guns that are suitable for personal protection. And you may come look at them, you may even handle them, but I'll tell you what the rule about handling is. If you pick up any of these guns, first thing you must do is check to make sure they're unloaded, and then the only safe direction is going to be this direction. Not down here, not up here, not over here, not over here, not back this way, only straight at this wall, and then stay up the table. I don't want anybody to step back with a gun like this where somebody else can step in front of them. Make sense? Okay. You may look at these guns during the break. You may even handle them. When you pick them up, make sure you check and make sure they're unloaded, and then make sure you treat them as if they are loaded. Let's talk about firearm storage. It makes sense that you are responsible for securing your firearm. Certainly, any of us would feel badly if our firearms fell into the hands of somebody who misused it, and somebody were injured as a result. There are both legal and moral dimensions to this issue. Let's talk about the legal dimensions first because they're more easily discussed. There was an incident, I guess about 8-10 years ago, I don't remember the exact year, where a guy from eastern Montana went to visit a sick parent in the hospital in Billings, left his pickup parked on the street, and a bunch of kids with juvenile records broke into it, stole his cigarettes and his camera and his tape recorder and his gun. And an hour later they were playing in a vacant lot in Billings, and one of the kids shot and killed another with a gun. The parents of the dead child sued the kid who was handling the gun and also sued the man who'd driven his pickup to Billings, alleging that he was financially liable for the pain and suffering of their family because he had not adequately stored his firearm. That went to the Montana Supreme Court, and the Montana Supreme Court ruled in one of its typically skitsy decisions that, on the one hand, the man who owned the gun was not responsible and not liable because he could not have reasonably foreseen that his inadequate storage would have been the proximate cause of the death of the dead child. On the other hand, they said he was responsible because he didn't store his firearm adequately. You're going, huh? Well, that's what everybody else did, huh? What does this mean? What it means is they let this guy off the hook, but they held everybody after that responsible to some standard they did not articulate. They didn't say, here's how you have to store your guns in order to be legally defensible. They didn't say that you have to lock them up or you have to deliver them all to Fort Knox or what. They just said that this guy and established case law saying that subsequent people would be financially liable if their guns or by implication other property were stolen and misused. Suppose their boat was stolen and people drowned. Person could be sued for owning the boat. Well, we fixed that in the next session of the legislature. We passed a law that said that if any of your property is stolen and somebody misuses it and somebody else is injured as a result, you're not responsible. It's the responsibility of the person who was stolen and was using the property. You're welcome. Still, I believe that the moral standard is a higher standard. Certainly, all of us would be troubled forever if we had our guns stolen and it were used and injured some innocent person. So we now have a moral responsibility to secure our firearms that I think is higher threshold than the current legal threshold. So I want to talk about that moral threshold and what you can do, what we recommend that you should be doing. The responsibility is that you don't let your firearm fall into the hands of somebody who's going to misuse it. And in order to do that, we think that either you need to be in personal possession of it where you can control it, or you need to have one lock between the firearm and the person who would steal it and misuse it. Now, what does that mean? Let's discuss that in a little more detail. One lock means that if you lock your house and your house is decently secure, the windows are closed and latched and that kind of stuff, then I believe you have satisfied that moral obligation to protect your firearms, to secure your firearms. If you don't secure your house, suppose you're the person who leaves the coffee on so the neighbors can wander in and get a cup of coffee during the day. And there are people, especially in rural Montana, who have that kind of attitude. Then I think you need to keep your firearms in a room that has a secure lock, a deadbolt or something like that, or you need to keep them in a locked gun cabinet, or you need to keep them in a locked gun safe or something like that if you don't or can't secure your house. We're going to talk about kids and guns at length in a minute, so let's save that for later. If you leave your guns in your car, any guns in your car, I think first of all they need to be out of sight where they're not a temptation, and your car must be locked. If you've done that, you have satisfied the moral obligation to secure your firearms. Suppose you have a gun with you in your workplace. Suppose it's in your purse, and you have to go down the hall to use the copy machine. If you leave your purse lying on your desk, you have violated the rule of security. It's not in your possession where you can control it, and it's not secured or locked up. But suppose you have a locking drawer in your desk, and you put your gun in there and you lock the drawer, and then you go down the hall to the copy machine. I think you have satisfied the requirement for securing your firearm. Or suppose the gun's in your purse and you take your purse with you down the hall to make the copies, then it's in your personal possession where it's under your control, and I think you have satisfied the need for securing your firearm. Always one lock between or personal possession, I think are adequate to secure your firearm, but I think that's the minimum. Now there may be cases where you may have to exceed that minimum, but let's go on and talk about kids and guns. You know, we talked about how many guns there are in Montana and how our kids have a better safety record than the national average. Well, it's part of it because it's our culture, and we learn this stuff and we pass it on to our kids. I was surprised when I was talking with my son about it when he was in like the 5th grade. We were talking about gun safety, and I said, do kids ever talk about this? And he said, oh yeah, kids talk about it on the playground, stuff like that, you know, proper gun safety. And I think that's good, but that reinforces to me that it's part of Montana culture. The fact that it's part of Montana culture doesn't mean that we can ignore it. It means we have to follow that up with our own instructions and behavior.